The Black Heritage video title Pastor Stopped Wedding when he felt dark presence around the bride. What he discovered next shocked everyone, opening fast-paced cinematic music swells. Three quick, high-stakes scenes flash on screen with dramatic zooms and text overlays. Scene 1: action hook, crowded church in Abin's town. Pastor Ifeanyi suddenly stands up from his seat, eyes wide with terror. He pushes through the aisle, robe flying, and storms straight to the altar where the bride and groom stand smiling. The congregation gasps. Bold red text on screen: he stopped the wedding. Instantly seen 2 close-up on Pastor Ifeanyi's face. A dark, swirling shadow only he can see wraps around the beautiful bride, Adana Chukwu. Her eyes flicker with an unnatural red glow for a split second. Pastor freezes, hand raised. Text overlay: he felt a dark presence around the bride. Scene 3: Pastor shouts, "This wedding ends now." Chaos erupts. Bride's smile vanishes. Groom looks confused. Congregation stands in shock. Text overlay: what he discovered next shocked everyone. Screen fades to black for a second. Narrator warm, urgent voice: before we dive deep into this powerful story of spiritual warfare, please do these 3 things right now. 1. Hit the like button if you believe in the power of prayer. 2. Share this video with at least 3 people who need deliverance. 3. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another life-changing testimony. Your support helps us bring more real stories like this every week. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1: The wedding that was never meant to happen. In the quiet but prosperous town of Abins in Abia State, the sun shone brightly on what everyone thought would be the perfect wedding day. The air carried the lightness of celebration, the kind that settles over a community when 2 beloved families are finally joined in a union long anticipated and broadly approved. Colorful aso oak filled every pew, fabric in shades of deep gold, royal blue, rich burgundy, and elegant cream. Sparkling jewelry caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. Children ran between the legs of adults, tugging at wrappers, laughing with the uncomplicated joy that children bring to occasions they do not yet fully understand but feel completely. Outside, the reception tent had already been transformed into something magnificent. Caterers moved purposefully among rows of tables draped in white linen. The sweet smell of fried plantain and jollof rice wafted through the warm air, mixing with the fragrance of cut flowers arranged along every surface. A live band tuned their instruments in the far corner. The master of ceremonies, a well-known event host from Aba, was practicing his lines while adjusting his lapel microphone. Chindu Ez, one of the richest oil businessmen in the state, stood proudly at the altar in his custom-tailored suit, pale cream with subtle golden thread, made by a Lagos tailor 3 months earlier. His groomsmen flanked him in matching agbada, broad-shouldered and proud, men who had been Chindu's friends since university, and who had never imagined they would one day watch him be brought so close to destruction. Adana looked breathtaking in her white lace gown. The design had taken a Port Harcourt seamstress 4 weeks to complete, hand-embroidered flowers trailing from the bodice to the hem, a cathedral-length veil anchored by fresh white flowers pinned into her elaborately styled hair. Her makeup was flawless, her smile radiant. No one could have guessed that something evil was hiding behind that beauty. Not her mother weeping proud tears in the front row. Not Chindu's mother, who had initially resisted the match and then come around so completely. She now called Adana my daughter, even before the wedding. Not the aunties, uncles, or childhood friends who had traveled from Abuja and London to witness the day. The choir was dressed in matching gold and white, their voices filling the building with glorious harmony. The song was "How Great Thou Art," a classic, beloved by elders and known by the young, the kind of music that could move a skeptic without announcing it was doing so. Pastor Ifeanyi had been at Victory Life Church for 23 years. He had arrived as a young assistant minister of 27, full of fire and very little wisdom, and had grown slowly into a man the community trusted with their deepest secrets and their most urgent crises. He had presided over hundreds of weddings, counseled couples on the edge of divorce, sat at bedsides during illnesses, and stood at gravesides in the rain. He was not a man who startled easily, but the moment he stepped onto the pulpit that Saturday morning, something hit him. It was not a dramatic vision. It was not a booming voice from above. It was a knowing the kind that settles in the stomach and radiates outward before the mind has formed a sentence around it. Every instinct that 23 years of ministry had sharpened told him simultaneously something is deeply, dangerously wrong. His spiritual eyes opened, and he saw it clearly, a thick black shadow swirling around Adana like smoke from a ritual fire. Red threads, invisible to everyone else, tied her wrists and ankles, pulling her toward an unseen force. The shadow moved with intelligence. It was not random darkness but directed, purposeful, ancient. It knew he could see it, and for one long, terrible second it seemed to look back at him. The pastor's heart pounded. He had felt this same presence only once before, the night his own sister disappeared after marrying a stranger from the village. That had been 19 years ago. He had prayed and fasted for weeks afterward, blaming himself for his silence. He would not be silent again. Without thinking, Pastor Ifeanyi dropped the microphone. It hit the pulpit floor with a loud crack. He marched down the steps, pushed past the best man, and strode to the altar with an expression that made people scramble out of his path without fully knowing why. "Stop," he boomed, his voice reaching every corner of the building. "This wedding is canceled. In the name of Jesus, I say stop." The choir cut off mid-note. Every phone in the building came out simultaneously. 100 sharp intakes of breath were followed by the particular silence of a large group waiting to see what happens before they allow themselves to react. Adana's smile did not fade gradually. It simply vanished, replaced by a cold, empty stare that made the bridesmaid nearest her take a small step backward without understanding why. For a split second, Adana's lips moved, forming words in an ancient tongue no one could identify. Chaos exploded. "Pastor, what is this?" Chindu shouted. "Have you gone mad? Do you know what today is? Do you know how long we have planned this?" Adana's mother was on her feet, her voice rising above the crowd. The groom's father pushed through to the front. "Ifeanyi," he said, his voice controlled but dangerous, "I have known you since you were this high. I respected your father, but today you have gone too far." But Pastor Ifeanyi stood firm, his Bible raised. "Sir," he said, meeting the old man's eyes directly, "I would rather you hate me today and your son live than stay quiet today and stand at your son's graveside next month." The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. I felt a dark presence around this bride the moment I saw her at the altar. Something is not right. Something is very, very wrong. And I will not proceed until I know what it is. The wedding that was supposed to join two powerful families had just become the talk of the town and the beginning of a battle no one saw coming. Chapter 2. The confession that shattered the church. The pastor's private office was a modest room. A wooden desk, 2 bookshelves lined with theology texts and worn Bibles, a small window overlooking the compound's back fence, and 2 wooden benches. It had seen many difficult conversations over 23 years. But the conversation that happened there on the afternoon of what should have been Adana and Chindu's wedding day was different from all of them. Adana sat on the wooden bench in a simple wrapper, her wedding gown bundled in a corner. Without the gown and veil, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Her makeup had been partially cried off. Her hair was still elaborate, still pinned with white flowers, but 2 flowers had fallen loose, and she held them in her hands without seeming to know she was doing so. Pastor Ifeanyi sat across from her. Brother Uchenna, the church security head, a quiet, large man of 45 who had served in the military before finding faith, stood near the door. Inspector Chibuzo, who had been among the wedding guests in his personal capacity as a longtime church member, sat in the corner with his notebook. At first she denied everything. "I don't know what you're talking about, Pastor. I love Chindu. This was my wedding day." "I know," the pastor said gently. "I can see that part of you loves him. I'm not questioning your feelings. I'm asking about what those feelings are attached to. I'm asking about what else is there." Adana shook her head. Her jaw tightened. "The red threads," the pastor said quietly, "around your wrists and ankles. I could see them from the pulpit." Something shifted in her face, the specific shift of a person who has maintained a performance and suddenly realizes the audience already knows the ending. As the pastor began to pray in tongues, the atmosphere in the room changed. A temperature drop that could not be explained by the ceiling fan. A heaviness that pressed on the chest. Brother Uchenna straightened. Inspector Chibuzo stopped writing. Adana began to shake, not the trembling of someone cold, but a full-body shaking that moved through her in waves. Her eyes rolled back. When the voice came, it was not her voice. It was deeper, older, and layered in a way that a human throat cannot produce. She belongs to us. The Shadow Sisterhood has claimed her. She was marked before she knew your name. Then, as quickly as it had come, the voice was gone. Adana collapsed forward, sobbing with a depth that only comes from carrying something for years and finally releasing it. She cried for a long time. The pastor let her. I was only 14 when they took me, she finally whispered. The story came out over the next 2 hours. The Shadow Sisterhood, a secret cult of women who targeted wealthy men, entered their lives through carefully arranged relationships, depleted their resources through financial manipulation and ritual practice, then killed them by untraceable methods to inherit everything. Her aunt, a woman she had loved, who had brought her gifts and told her she was special, had been the entry point. By the time Adana understood what she was being drawn into, she was already in. The covenant had been made on the night of her 15th birthday, dressed as a celebration. A drink, she was told, was palm wine with herbs, words spoken over her by the high priestess. A small cut on her left inner ankle pressed against a bowl. She had not known what the bowl contained until much later. After that night, she belonged to them. She would pursue the target they assigned. She would use the love charm they provided. She would follow the timeline they set. And her little sister Chisholm was the guarantee held like a key in their pocket. Any deviation, any attempt to warn the target, any contact with spiritual authorities, and Chisholm would pay. I tried to find another way for 3 years, Adana said, her voice raw. I went to a prayer house once and said nothing specific, just asked for deliverance from bondage, and they found out within 2 days. They took Chisholm for a week. I never went back. She described the love charm, a small cloth packet worn inside her bra, kept within a foot of Chindu at all times. She described the honeymoon instructions, a powdered substance dissolved in his drink, administered gradually over 4 days, producing symptoms that would be diagnosed as viral fever and would progress to organ failure within 3 weeks of the wedding. She reached into her wrapper and produced the small cloth packet. She placed it on the edge of the pastor's desk without touching it more than necessary. I was going to throw it away tonight, she said. I had decided. Whatever they did to Chisholm, I couldn't look at Chindu one more time and do what I was supposed to do, but I never wanted this, she cried. Every night I see the faces of the men we have already killed. 3 men, Pastor. I see their faces every time I close my eyes. I want out, but they will never let me go. The only exit they have ever offered me is death. Pastor Ifeanyi placed his hand on her head. Today, daughter, the blood of Jesus begins to break every covenant that was made over your life, including those made when you were too young to choose freely. But this battle has layers, and we must be prepared to face all of them. He looked at Inspector Chibuzo. We need to find Chisholm. Tonight. Chapter 3. The investigation that opened the gates of hell. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of secret meetings, careful movements, and midnight prayers. Pastor Ifeanyi, Brother Uchenna, and Inspector Chibuzo worked in deliberate coordination, each bringing different skills to a problem that required all of them simultaneously. Inspector Chibuzo did not open a formal case file immediately. A formal file would create a paper trail visible to others in the building, and he was not yet confident about who could be trusted. Instead, he pulled old records under the cover of routine archival work and began cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. Old newspaper clippings revealed 3 other wealthy men in neighboring towns who had died mysteriously within weeks of their weddings, all married to beautiful women who later disappeared. The causes of death listed were mundane cardiac arrest, undetermined fever, a road accident while traveling to a medical facility. The pattern was not obvious unless you were looking for it. The marriages had been spread across a 5-year window, across different jurisdictions, with no publicly traceable connection between the brides. But Inspector Chibuzo was looking, and once he was looking, the pattern was unmistakable. He brought the files to the pastor's house in a paper bag at 7 in the evening and spread them across the sitting room floor. Someone in authority knew, the inspector said finally. These cases were never properly investigated. 3 separate jurisdictions, 3 separate sets of officers, and not one of these deaths triggered a cross-reference investigation. That level of institutional failure is not accidental. Using clues from Adana's confession, the team traced her movements and discovered a hidden path behind the old palm oil mill leading into the forbidden forest of Ugwuel. The forest was a fixed feature of local consciousness, a place that appeared on no official map, but was known to everyone by instinct and by warnings passed from grandparents to grandchildren across generations. No one had tried to develop the land. No government official had ever pushed the question. What no one had found, because no one had gone looking, was what the Shadow Sisterhood had been building there for longer than anyone alive could accurately estimate. Under the cover of night, the 3 men crept through thick bushes, boots wet from the long grass, flashlights held low to the ground. Brother Uchenna moved with the specific controlled alertness that military training produces and never entirely leaves. They found it in a clearing that had been coaxed or cut wider over many years. The sacred grove altar. It was larger than any of them had imagined. A stone structure at the center, broad and flat, stained in layers of dark that spoke of years of use. Candles of varying sizes burned on the stone and on the ground around it. The smell was thick incense and something else beneath it that none of the 3 men could or wanted to name. 17 human skulls arranged in a precise circle around the altar. Red threads exactly like those the pastor had seen around Adana strung between stakes driven into the ground. Strange symbols carved deliberately into the bark of every tree at the clearing's edge. Brother Uchenna almost vomited when he saw fresh photographs of Chindu pinned to the altar with iron nails. Close-up photographs of his face, his office, his home. His name written and folded 7 times, soaked in dark liquid, pressed under a heavy stone at the altar's center. Personal items, a monogrammed handkerchief, a piece of fabric from one of his shirts. Around the perimeter, shallow depressions in the earth, items buried just below the surface, wrapped in cloth. Inspector Chibuzo marked each location with a small flag, a previous victim's wristwatch, a leather wallet with a national ID still inside, a cracked, mud-caked mobile phone. They were planning to finish him this weekend, Brother Uchenna whispered. The charm was supposed to be in place by the wedding night. As they photographed everything, the forest changed. A drop in temperature, a cessation of the insect sounds that had accompanied them from the forest's edge. Then a cold wind that moved through the clearing without touching the candle flames, which continued to burn perfectly upright. The shadows between the trees moved in ways that did not correspond to anything that could be casting them. A woman's laughter echoed from no identifiable direction, not cheerful, not mocking, but carrying with it something like anticipation. The 3 men ran. There is no more dignified way to describe it. Back at the church, Pastor Ifeanyi called an emergency prayer meeting with 12 of his most trusted and spiritually grounded members. He organized them into 3 specific intercession groups, each with a clear assignment and a senior leader. Prayer without intelligence is noise, he told them. And intelligence without prayer leaves us weaponless. We need both. By morning, 3 anonymous tips had reached the police station from different numbers, all reporting suspicious activity near Ugwuel. Inspector Chibuzo had made none of those calls. Chapter 4: The traitor hiding in plain sight. The pastor knew from the first day that the cult was receiving inside information. Movements he had made privately were anticipated. Conversations held in confidence had consequences the next morning. The cult adjusted every time the team adjusted, with a responsiveness that required a source inside the inner circle. He began to watch everyone closely, not with suspicion that distorted his perception, but with the careful attention of a man who has learned that the most dangerous threats are rarely strangers. Sister Eber had served Victory Life Church as its secretary for 8 years. She was 34, educated, efficient, and warm. She remembered the names of members' children and the details of their family situations. She was, by every outward measure, the kind of person a church community depends on without fully recognizing how much until they are gone. She brought the pastor tea during the long evening meetings that followed the interrupted wedding. She offered to type reports, organize files, coordinate communication. She asked careful questions about the investigation's progress, always framed as administrative necessity, as scheduling concern, as practical helpfulness. But the pastor was watching her face. One evening, when he mentioned casually that they had found a significant piece of evidence giving no specifics, he watched something move through Sister Eber's expression before her usual warmth resettled itself. It lasted less than a second, but he had been watching for it. He said nothing. He waited. While reviewing security footage from the church compound's cameras one night, Brother Uchenna found what he had not expected. At 2:17 a.m., 5 nights after the interrupted wedding, Sister Eber appeared on camera at the back gate. She was dressed in black, not casual dark clothing, but deliberate, practical darkness. She carried a small calabash. She slipped out the gate with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. She returned 2 hours and 11 minutes later. The calabash was empty. Her face was composed, not relieved, not frightened, not conflicted. Simply resolved. Brother Uchenna went back through the footage. 5 previous instances over the past 3 months. Every single night she had made a midnight exit coincided with a day on which something significant had happened inside the church's investigation. He brought the findings to Pastor Ifeanyi at 5 in the morning and laid them on the desk without a word. The confrontation was deliberate and calm. Pastor Ifeanyi placed the security footage report face down on the desk before Sister Eber arrived. He poured tea for both of them. He asked about her family, her mother's health. He let her settle. He let her feel the ordinary safety of the room before removing it. Sister Eber, he said, turning the report over and placing it between them, why have you been reporting everything we do to the Shadow Sisterhood? Her performance of innocence lasted approximately 45 seconds. The right amount of offense, the right invoking of her years of service, the right confusion in the eyes. But when the pastor began to pray, something in the room shifted, the same shift that had happened when Adana confessed, and Sister Eber's performance collapsed entirely. They promised me power and money, she screamed, and it was the scream of something contained too long suddenly released. 8 years of filing and typing and bringing tea and watching other people's lives get better while mine stayed exactly the same. Adana was going to be paid for her work. I was going to be paid for mine. That was the arrangement. The story came out in full. A woman she had met at a trade fair in about 2 years earlier, friendly then generous then connected. An outer ring of the sisterhood that asked only for information and paid well for it. No rituals, they had told her. No covenants. Just sharing what she already knew. Just administrative detail passed along. Then they had found the affair, a 6-month relationship with a married deacon, ended with genuine remorse and buried in deep shame. The sisterhood produced photographs. The request for information became a requirement. And the arrangement that had started as something she told herself was morally neutral had slowly, quietly become collaboration in something she did not allow herself to look at directly. I never wanted anyone to die, she said, slumping against the wall, all the fight gone. I told myself the men were never actually in danger. I told myself that for 2 years, and you stopped telling yourself that? The pastor asked. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who has found the bottom. When Adana told me what she was supposed to do on the honeymoon night, 3 weeks ago, I couldn't unknow it after that, but you didn't stop. She said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. Sister Eber was handed over to Inspector Chibuzo and formally detained. The congregation was told she had taken a sudden leave of absence for family reasons. The pastor sat alone in his office for 20 minutes afterward, Bible in his hands, until the feeling in his chest settled into something he could work with. The final and most dangerous battle was still ahead. Chapter 5. The midnight raid on the cult's new base, armed with evidence from the sacred grove, Sister Eber's confession, and 3 weeks of patient intelligence gathering. Inspector Chibuzo, began the final phase with the care of a man who knows that one significant mistake will compromise everything. He assembled 7 officers, men whose backgrounds and loyalties he had tested in real situations, not theoretical ones. He briefed them in his car, engine running, parked away from the station building at 10 in the evening. The cult had discovered within 24 hours that the sacred grove had been found. When a follow-up team returned to Uguil in daylight, the altar had been partially dismantled, the skulls removed, the photographs of Chindu taken down. They had moved. But Sister Eber, in her final act of value to the investigation, had given the location of the backup base, a place she had been told about 3 months earlier, in case the primary location was ever compromised. An abandoned warehouse behind the old slaughterhouse on the outskirts of Auburn, unused for 11 years, purchased quietly by a holding company, whose ownership Inspector Chibuzo had spent 3 days tracing through official records. Arriving ultimately at a lawyer's name in Umuahia, he recognized from 2 previous unrelated cases involving questionable property transactions. Pastor Ifeanyi insisted on going. He had said so at the beginning of the planning meeting, and had not changed his position during the 20 minutes that Inspector Chibuzo spent arguing against it. The pastor listened to all of it with patient attention and said simply, "Inspector, you know as well as I do that what is in that building will not yield to guns alone. Take me or go in under-resourced." Inspector Chibuzo recognized the argument as one he could not refute and moved on. Brother Uchenna drove the lead vehicle. The convoy moved through Auburn's sleeping streets at 11:40 p.m., lights on until the last turn, then dark for the final stretch. The night was thick and warm. Crickets and frogs filled the air with sound. They reached the warehouse at 11:58 p.m. and held position for 90 seconds while Inspector Chibuzo's most experienced officer confirmed from the east side that the target was active. Lights visible through gaps in the roofing. Chanting audible from 40 meters. At midnight exactly, they moved. The warehouse doors came open with a force that swung them back against the walls. Inside, 15 women in white robes arranged in precise formation around a large stone altar dominating the center of the floor. Candles everywhere, organized into patterns on the floor and around the perimeter, burning in colors beyond the standard white and yellow. The air was thick with incense, and something else, a smell that registered as wrong before the brain had language for it. Symbols matching those from the sacred grove painted on the walls in dark red. And at the far back wall, bound to a chair, head dropped forward, breathing visibly in the inexplicable cold chisum. Alive, the 15 women did not scatter at the door's opening. They continued chanting. Several turned slowly to face the officers with expressions of such complete contempt that 2 officers involuntarily stepped backward. The high priestess stood behind the altar. She was a woman in her 50s, round-faced, broad-shouldered, wearing white robes with an additional sash of deep crimson. Half the town knew her as Mama Provisions, the fabric and goods seller who had operated a market stall for 20 years. She had attended the funerals of people she had helped kill. She had extended credit to families during hard seasons. She had sold fabric to women whose husbands she had ordered taken. She looked at Pastor Ifeanyi and laughed. "You," she said. "I have been watching you for 3 months. You and your Bible and your prayers. You think any of that reaches here?" She spread her arms wide, encompassing the room. "This is older than your church. Older than the missionaries who brought you that book. Older than anyone in your congregation's memory." The room dropped in temperature noticeably. All 15 candle flames stretched upward simultaneously and burned red for approximately 5 seconds. The shadows on the walls began to move independently of any physical object that could have been casting them, shapes approximating human forms, elongating and contracting and reaching across the painted symbols with something that looked, in the terrible logic of that room, like hunger. Brother Uchenna, who had stood firm through combat situations, and through the sacred grove visit, and through 3 weeks of this investigation, found his feet unwilling to move. 2 officers had stopped walking. One had his weapon raised, but his hand was shaking. Pastor Ifeanyi stepped forward. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not make any dramatic gesture. He simply stepped forward, planted his feet on the warehouse floor, squared his shoulders, and began to pray with a quiet authority that cut through the sound of chanting and cold and shadow more completely than shouting would have. Father, we stand in this place covered by the blood of Jesus Christ. Every covenant made here, every binding made here, every spirit assigned to this place and to these women, and to that child at the back of this room, we bring the authority of heaven to bear against you now. His voice grew as he continued, not louder exactly, but fuller, each sentence arriving with more weight than the last. Every marine spirit, every blood covenant, every altar of darkness catch fire now in the name of Jesus. The first candle exploded. Not toppled, exploded, the wax scattering outward, the flame extinguishing with a sound like a small percussion instrument. Then another, then 6 at once. The chanting faltered, individual voices dropping out as the women looked around in confusion, and something beneath confusion. The high priestess's composure cracked. She screamed something in an unrecognizable language and moved toward the pastor with a ritual knife that appeared in her hand, blade the color of old bone. Brother Uchenna, released from whatever had held him, crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and caught her wrist. She was stronger than a woman her age should have been. He held her. The altar cracked. A sound like a gunshot, sharp, loud, emanating from the stone itself as a fracture opened across its center from edge to edge. Dust rose from the split. The symbols on the walls began to run as though the paint was fresh, lines breaking apart and reforming into nothing meaningful, losing all coherence. The assembled women screamed and moved in different directions. Several fell to their knees. 2 tried for the side door and were met by officers positioned outside. The chanting stopped entirely. The high priestess collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Brother Uchenna went carefully to one knee with her as she went down, ensuring she did not injure her head despite everything. In 31 minutes from the doors opening, every member of the Shadow Sisterhood in that warehouse was in custody. Chisholm was carried to the waiting vehicle by Brother Uchenna, who had found the chair restraint keys on a hook near the back wall. She was alive. Her pulse was thin but steady. She did not regain consciousness until 2 minutes from the hospital, and when she opened her eyes and saw Brother Uchenna's face above hers, she gripped his arm with both hands and did not let go until the hospital staff gently separated them. The cult's power was broken that night. Chapter 6. The secrets that came out at dawn. The hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning has a particular quality: fluorescent lights that drain color from faces, plastic chairs that make every body ache, a silence punctuated by distant machinery and occasional footsteps down tiled corridors. Pastor Ifeanyi sat in this waiting room and breathed and let the enormity of the night settle into context. Brother Uchenna sat beside him, forearms on his knees, hands clasped. Inspector Chibuzo appeared at 40 minutes past 3, having driven from the station where the arrested women were being processed. 17 arrested, he said. 15 from inside, 2 from the yard. The high priestess is in medical observation. 3 of the younger women are talking. The information that came out over the following hours assembled a picture more extensive than the team had understood. The Shadow Sisterhood was not a local operation. Active branches in 4 states. Its structure deliberately tiered each level, knowing only what it needed to function, meaning the Abend's operations dismantling would not automatically dismantle the network. The high priestess was not the highest authority. She was the regional coordinator trusted by the upper structure, but not in possession of the full picture herself. The upper leadership communicated through encrypted messages delivered by women who appeared to be ordinary traders on ordinary routes. They were never present at rituals. Known to the high priestess by code names only, 3 of the 4 states with active branches had experienced clusters of unexplained wealthy man deaths over the previous decade, cases that had been quietly filed away, not because evidence was insufficient, but because something about each investigation had always felt interfered with. Someone in the system above my level, Inspector Chibuzo said quietly. I need to be very careful about which superior I take this to. There is a bishop in Enugu I trust completely, the pastor said. He has connections with the governor's office he has never misused in 20 years. Inspector Chibuzo wrote the name on a piece of paper he tucked into his shirt pocket rather than his notebook. Chindu arrived at the hospital at 5 in the morning. He sat with the pastor for a long time. The pastor told him what he needed to know in careful sequence, not sparing the difficult parts but delivering them with the steadiness of a man who has learned that truth handled gently is still truth. Chindu listened without interrupting. When the pastor finished, Chindu was quiet for almost 3 minutes. Then the love charm. Were my feelings, I believe, the pastor said carefully, that the feelings were real. What they used may have amplified and directed something already there. The evil in these situations does not manufacture from nothing. It distorts what already exists. Chindu nodded slowly. I want to see her. Not today, not this week, when she is ready. If she ever wants that, I will tell her, the pastor said. Chapter 7 The Road Back from Darkness. Adana's restoration was not a single dramatic event. Pastor Ifeanyi had watched too many deliverances be declared complete too quickly. Too many people pushed back into ordinary life before the slow work of rebuilding had been done, to make that mistake here. The dramatic moments, the office confrontation, the breaking of the altar, the arrests were the visible parts. What followed was less visible and equally important. He assembled a team of 3 women for Adana's ongoing care. Sister Ngozi, 61 years old, with 30 years in Christian ministry, and a grandmother's warmth combined with an absolute refusal to be moved by emotional performance. Sister Amaka, 40, trained as a counselor before coming to Victory Life Church, bringing both spiritual grounding and practical psychological knowledge. Sister Patience, 37, who had herself been delivered from serious spiritual bondage 11 years earlier, and understood from the inside what this road looked like. The 3 women met with Adana every morning for the first 2 weeks. They met in a small room at the back of the church. They prayed, but prayer was not the only thing that happened there. They talked. They listened. They asked questions and really waited for answers. They did not rush past the places where Adana went quiet or deflected or started to cry. They sat with her in those places. The questions that needed addressing were not only spiritual. Adana had no independent financial resources. Her employment for the past 3 years had been loosely constructed around the sisterhood's needs. She had no clear path forward. Sister Amaka worked through these questions with her methodically, not in the first week, when Adana was still in the acute phase of recovery, but in the second and third weeks, when the immediate crisis had passed and the question of what came next became real. Adana's mother came to the pastor on the 3rd day after the raid. She arrived at 8 in the morning and sat alone in the church foyer until he came. She was not the woman who had shouted at him on the wedding day. She had collapsed somewhat in the intervening days, the gap between the wedding she had planned and the truth she now knew having done something to her that could not easily be undone. She sat across from the pastor and asked every question she had been afraid to ask, and received honest answers. It was 2 hours, covering ground that required courage from both people. She wept for most of the middle portion. At the end she said, "She was never mine to protect in the way I thought she was. I didn't see the danger that was closest to her. Neither did I for years," the pastor said. "This enemy is skilled at hiding in ordinary things." She returned the next morning, and the morning after. By the end of the first week she had joined the morning prayer group, taking a seat slightly apart at first and then, by the second week, fully among the others. Chisholm was discharged from hospital after 4 days, physically unharmed in ways the doctors could measure. Emotionally, she was quiet in a way that worried the nurses, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a person who has pulled far inward. The church counselor, a young woman named Sister Ifeanyi who worked specifically with adolescents, visited her twice at the hospital and 3 times at the family home after discharge. Patient, consistent, not trying to move Chisholm faster than Chisholm was moving. Chisholm began to speak in the 2nd week, tentatively, in fragments. By the 3rd week she was speaking more fully, not about the warehouse, not yet, but about her life before. Her school friends. A teacher she had liked. Small things that told the counselor the person inside the quietness was still there and still moving toward the surface. Chindu came to see Adana on the 14th day after the raid. He came alone, without his family, without any announcement. He had called Pastor Ifeanyi 2 days earlier to ask if it was appropriate. The pastor had put the question to Sister Ngozi, who put it to Adana, who said yes after thinking for a full day. They met in the small back room with Sister Ngozi seated near the door, visible but not intrusive. Chindu made no declarations. He said, "I have been trying to think clearly about this for 2 weeks, and I cannot think clearly about it yet. But I know I don't want to disappear from your life just because things became complicated." Adana looked at him for a long time. "Then I need you to know everything before you decide anything. Not the summary, everything. Tell me," he said. She told him. It took most of the morning. Sister Ngozi sat by the door and said nothing. At the end of it, Chindu was quiet for a long moment. "Then the men who died, you carry them every night. Is there anything I can do to help carry that with you?" It was not the answer to a romantic question. It was the answer to a human one, and it was exactly right. Sister Ngozi, walking to her car afterward, stopped to speak to the pastor who was waiting in the compound. She was not a sentimental woman, but she said those two may make it. If they go slowly, the pastor said. And with help. "I'll make sure of it," she said. Chapter 8. The trial that shook Abia State. The court proceedings that followed the arrests moved at the pace of the Nigerian justice system, which is to say, not quickly. Inspector Chibuzo had anticipated this and prepared his case with the thoroughness of a man who understands that evidence must be so complete and carefully organized that the passage of time cannot erode it. The charges were substantial: human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, unlawful imprisonment, evidence tampering in connection with the 3 previous deaths, money laundering through a series of businesses that forensic accountants took 3 weeks to map completely. The charge sheet ran to 47 pages. The high priestess, whose real name was Mrs. Ifeoma Nnachi, born in 1971 in Umuahia, recovered from the physical collapse in the warehouse within 48 hours. She arrived at her first court appearance composed, her lawyer at her side. She had found from somewhere very good legal representation very quickly, which told Inspector Chibuzo something about the sisterhood's resources. News coverage was significant. Reporters came from Lagos, Port Harcourt, Abuja. The story had everything journalism requires: drama, mystery, community impact, a villain who had hidden in plain sight, a rescuer figure in the pastor, a victim whose story contained enough complexity to resist easy summarizing. The pastor declined most interview requests, citing the ongoing case and his concern for Adana's privacy. He gave one brief written statement: "The greatest danger is always the one we have learned not to see." Adana was formally a witness for the prosecution. Inspector Chibuzo and the state prosecutor worked with her carefully over several weeks, preparing her testimony to be thorough and able to withstand cross-examination. They discussed directly the defense's anticipated strategy to portray Adana as a willing participant, whose claims of coercion were constructed after the fact so that, when it arrived, she would not be surprised. The defense did exactly what had been anticipated. The lead counsel argued that Adana's participation had been sustained and deliberate, and that the evidence against Mrs. Nnachi had been obtained through a private raid, lacking proper authorization. Inspector Chibuzo had anticipated the authorization argument and secured retroactive judicial approval within 12 hours of the raid, a process facilitated at unusual speed through the Enugu bishop's connections. Sister Eber appeared in court looking considerably reduced from the woman who had served the church for 8 years, not dramatically, but in the way people look when they have removed a performance worn so long they had partly forgotten was a performance. She gave her testimony in a steady voice and answered cross-examination without becoming defensive or embellishing, simply telling what she had done, what she had known, and when she had known it. 3 of the younger women arrested in the warehouse cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for significantly reduced charges. Their testimonies provided operational detail that corroborated and extended what Adana had already provided. One was 19 years old, recruited 2 years earlier while still in secondary school through what she had believed was an ordinary social media friendship. Her testimony drew a silence from the courtroom that lasted long enough for the judge to glance up from his notes. The trials moved through preliminary hearings, plea arrangements, adjournments, and evidence challenges over many months. The pastor followed the proceedings with steady attention, but deliberately prevented them from becoming the center of the church community's focus. The story was important. The justice process was important. But a community's identity cannot be built on a crisis, no matter how significant. Two other women in the congregation came quietly to Pastor Ifeanyi in the weeks following the Thanksgiving service, drawn by the specific honesty of Adana's testimony. Their situations were different histories, different degrees of involvement, different forms of bondage. But the pastor's response to each was the same: patient, structured, judgment-free engagement. He brought in the same team who had walked Adana through her restoration and expanded it by one, adding a male counselor for cases requiring that perspective. He did not talk publicly about these additional cases. He simply did the work. Chapter 9. The victory that shocked the entire town. The Thanksgiving service was held on a Sunday that the weather seemed to have prepared for, clear and bright, with a cool valley breeze that made the heat bearable without eliminating the warm sense of occasion. By 7:30, 45 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin, every seat in the church was filled. By 8:15, people were standing in doorways, along outside walls, and seated in the yard where the public address system had been extended to reach them. Pastor Ifeanyi had planned the service carefully, consulting Adana about its structure, asking what she was comfortable with and what she was not, building the program around her answer. He had made clear to the church leadership that this was genuine Thanksgiving, not a showcase, not a sensation, not a performance of triumph, and that the tone of the day would reflect that commitment. Adana stood before the congregation in a simple dress, without the elaborate staging of the intended wedding day. No professional makeup, her hair natural. She had considered writing out her testimony but decided against it, feeling that reading from paper would create a distance between her words and the people hearing them. She stood at the microphone with Sister Ngozi sitting in a chair 6 feet behind her and began to speak. She told the truth, not the abbreviated, dramatically shaped version that would have served a certain kind of religious story. The actual truth, with its years of shame and compliance and desperate partial attempts at escape, the nights of seeing the faces of men she could not bring back. The truth about the 14-year-old girl who had been found in a moment of vulnerability and gently, systematically, lovingly led into captivity, because that was how it had felt in the beginning before she understood what it was. The congregation was very quiet, not the performed quiet of a polite audience, the listening quiet of people encountering something real. "I am not free because I was strong," Adana said toward the end. "I am free because one man on a pulpit was willing to look foolish in front of 400 people, and because 3 women were willing to sit with me in a small room every morning for 6 weeks, and because the inspector was willing to go into the forest at night, and because my mother was willing to be broken open and rebuilt at the age of 52. My freedom is not a solo story. It is everyone who refused to look away." She paused. "If you are in something right now that you believe no one can know about, if you have made a promise that is eating you from inside, if someone has something on you that has been controlling your life for years, I want you to know that the darkness does not get to keep you just because it found you when you were young. It does not get to keep you." Tears were everywhere in the building. Not the easy emotional tears that come with affecting music, but the heavier, slower tears of personal recognition. 3 women near different sections of the building wept in ways that were not simply emotional response. Pastor Ifeanyi noticed. He said nothing during the service. The 3 women who had walked Adana through her restoration sat together in the 3rd row. Sister Ngozi's hands folded in her lap. Sister Amaka's eyes closed. Sister Patience watching Adana with quiet joy that came from a place that knew exactly what the distance between where Adana had been and where she stood now actually looked like. Chindu sat near the back, alone in the last seat of the last row against the wall. He had come not as the narrative's romantic resolution, but as a member of a community that had fought something together and gathered to mark that they had won. His face was calm. He was simply present. After the service, in the receiving line that formed naturally at the church doors, two of the three women who had wept with that particular weight came to Pastor Ifeanyi. He received them warmly and without fanfare, said a few quiet words, and gave each one Sister Ngozi's phone number. He did not ask what they needed to disclose. He simply made sure they had a way back. The sacred grove in Ugweel Forest was formally dealt with on the Thursday of the following week. A prayer team of 8 people, accompanied by Inspector Chibuze as legal witness and 2 additional officers, entered the clearing in daylight. The buried items had already been retrieved by forensic teams under proper protocol. The remaining structure was dismantled physically, the stone altar broken down with tools brought for the purpose, the carved symbols removed from the trees as completely as could be managed, the red threads collected and burned on site. The pastor led prayers over the land for an hour afterward, standing in the cleared space, his voice steady, until the clearing felt like what it was, just a clearing in a forest, full of trees and birds and ordinary air. The abandoned warehouse was sealed by court order and eventually demolished by the property owner, who cooperated fully once the holding company obscuring ownership was identified, and its directors faced their own legal questions. Adana's mother was baptized in a private, small ceremony attended only by the pastor, the 3 restoration women, and Chisholm, who stood at the edge of the pool and watched with an expression that was still quiet but no longer heavy. She was beginning to sound like herself again, returning to school cautiously with support, not yet the person she had been before the warehouse, but on her way to someone. 6 months after the raid, with the trial still ongoing, Chindu and Adana met with the pastor to discuss the future. They had been meeting regularly for months, not as a romantic couple restoring a relationship on its original timeline, but as 2 people building something new, informed by what had been learned. They had talked about everything. They had been counseled individually and together. They had taken nothing for granted. They told the pastor they would like to plan a wedding. Small. Family only. No public announcement, no press, no social media. A covenant made before God and witnessed by the people who had been present in the difficult parts of the story. The pastor said he would be honored to officiate. He married them on a quiet Tuesday morning in the church, with 23 people present. Sister Ngozi cried and denied it immediately when Sister Amaka pointed it out. Chisholm, standing beside her mother in the front row, laughed at this real, genuine laugh that made several people turn to look at her with the particular relief of people who have been waiting for that sound for a very long time. Inspector Chibuze received a commendation from the state for the investigation 3 months later. He accepted it briefly, said little, and was seen the following Sunday sitting in the back row of Victory Life Church for the first time in years. Brother Uchenna continued his work as church security head and began volunteering 1 evening per week with a youth mentoring program. The pastor had started in the months following the case, working specifically with young people identified as vulnerable to the kind of recruitment that had reached Adana at 14. The town of Aubins would never be the same. What started as a wedding day interruption became the deliverance of an entire community, not just from the Shadow Sisterhood, but from the particular silence that communities maintain around the dangerous things hiding in their ordinary center. Pastor Ifeanyi stood at the pulpit on the Sunday closest to the 1-year anniversary of the interrupted wedding and spoke without notes, looking out at the full church, at Adana and Chindu in the 5th row, at Chisholm beside her mother, at Brother Uchenna near the side door, at Sister Ngozi, who was nodding slowly, at Inspector Chibuze in the back row, looking at the floor in the way that men look at floors when something has reached them. They have not given themselves permission to show on their faces. "A year ago," he said, "I dropped a microphone and stopped a wedding. People in this room called me mad that day. Some of you still, privately, wonder what would have happened if I had stayed silent. I understand that question. I have asked it myself about other moments in my life where I stayed silent when I should have moved. Here is what I want you to take with you today. The voice of God does not always come in the form you have been taught to expect. Sometimes it comes as an inexplicable knowing in the pit of your stomach. Sometimes it comes as a discomfort you cannot reason your way out of. Sometimes it comes as a grief you feel for someone who appears to have everything. Do not educate yourself out of these moments. Do not defer to what is comfortable or what is socially acceptable or what will avoid an embarrassing scene. The most important things I have ever done for the people God gave me to serve were done in moments when I looked like a fool from the outside. When you feel that dark presence in a room, in a relationship, in a situation you cannot yet name, do not ignore it. Do not explain it away. Do not let the noise of other people's comfort silence what God is showing you. Because the person standing next to you may be waiting for someone brave enough to see what they cannot see themselves. God will always show up. But he needs someone willing to move when they are told to move, even when moving looks like madness. He paused for a long moment, the church completely still around him. Never ignore it, the pastor said for the last time. God sees what you cannot see. Trust him enough to obey. Closing screen, dramatic music fades slowly. Text appears one line at a time, like, if this story touched your heart, share with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Subscribe for more powerful testimonies every week. Comment Amen if you believe God can expose every hidden darkness. Comment DELIVERED if this story spoke to something in your life. End of video. Next.